I'd like to thank everybody for attending this afternoon. Climate change is real. Increase the CO2 concentration and the temperature of the Earth increases. This uncontested science goes back over 150 years when Eunice Foote of Seneca Falls, New York in 1856 demonstrated that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas that leads to global warming. In 1790, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the carbon dioxide concentration was approximately 280 parts per million. Today, it is 415 parts per million and rising. Climate change is real, and it's here now. The New York Times recently reported that Louisiana divided its southeastern coast, parts of which are being lost to rising seas, into low, medium, and high-risk zones, with the goal of having the high-risk zones transition away from permanent residential development. The Florida Keys delivered a similar message to residents, saying there wasn't enough money to elevate every county road above the rising sea. And last year, Virginia issued a coastal development plan that bluntly acknowledged that flooding and inundation would force retreat from many coastal areas, requiring public and private buildings and infrastructure to be moved to higher ground to avoid destruction. Just a few days ago, 300 leaders of major corporations wrote President Biden asking the administration to nearly double the target for cutting greenhouse gases to 50% by 2030. It will be impossible for the U.S. to achieve these cuts without the participation of local communities such as ours. We need more electric cars and buses, more charging stations, more solar and wind farms, more electric heat pumps to heat and cool our homes, and better insulated homes. We need to start planning now for a future significantly less dependent on fossil fuels. Otherwise, we will enter a world where catastrophic storms, extreme droughts and floods, mega fires, new diseases, and insect pests affecting our agriculture and forests will be the norm. It will be a world of runaway climate change. We felt the religious community was uniquely situated because of our concern for creation that unites people across religious perspectives. We hoped a statement by leaders of faith would resonate across the political divide in central New York and spark a discussion on how we as a community could start this transition away from fossil fuels now. The following statement: given the dangers represented by the continued burning of fossil fuels to the planet we depend upon for life, and the importance of the next 10 years in keeping the planet under 1.5 degrees centigrade of heating, we urge the community in central to New York to start planning a transition away from fossil fuels now. This statement was endorsed by a broad spectrum of religious leaders: Baptist, Catholic, earth-based spiritualities, Episcopal, Hindu, Jewish, Lutheran, Methodist, Muslim, Native American, Presbyterian, United Church of Christ, Unitarian, Sikh, Tibetan Buddhist, and Zen. I would like to introduce our first speaker, the Episcopal Bishop, Dr. Dede.
Thank you, Peter. I'm very honored to be here to speak on this important topic, because addressing climate change in our world is central to the core values of people of faith. As a Christian and as an Episcopalian, I see God as the ground of all being and the creator. In the Episcopal Diocese of Central New York, we have a rural vision and mission for life. Our mission statement is that we're learning to love God, one another, and all God's creation. It is clear that when climate change occurs and is occurring in our world, that people of color, people of poverty, people who are not, do not have the power over their environment, are often the first to suffer the tragic consequences. As people of faith, it is essential that we not only speak out, but that we take measures to ensure that we're doing the best we can do to be part of the solutions involved in this multivalent, complex issue of climate change. I'm privileged to be here with all of you and to be committed to this issue, not only within the Episcopal Diocese of Central New York, where we are taking this threat seriously, but also across our nation and our world, that working together, we can address some of the systemic and spiritual issues that contribute to climate change and also reduce fossil fuel use and address that need. So thank you for the honor of being here with you and talking about this important conversation.
Thank you, Bishop Dede. Our next speaker is Oran Lyons from the Onondaga Nation. Oran is an internationally known Indigenous human rights and climate change activist and scholar. He first spoke on the issue of climate change at the United Nations in 2000. Oran? Let's see. Oran, you're on mute, Oran. Oran, you're on. Olivia?
You should be able to unmute. Let me see. There it goes.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you, Oran.
I'm technology. I'm a Luddite. I'm back there in the 19th century yet, but I want to add my voice to this illustrious group here, and just simply to say that the Haudenosaunee, the better known as the Six Nation Iroquois Confederation, our foundational principle is peace. The great tree of peace is our symbol. The great white roots, the four white roots of truth in the four directions, the great peace. That's our foundation. And so that's been our mission. My mission in life has always been peace. So I just want to add my support to this effort here to bring awareness to the very, I would say, diverted public that we have here. They're not looking at the realities that we face, and that very dire straits we're in at this point. So I will say that when I made this speech at the United Nations in 2000, and I brought the issue of peace forward and so forth, and brought the issue of the environment. I said the ice was melting. The ice was melting in the north, it's melting in the mountains, it's melting everywhere. That was 2000. So here we are, 21 years later, and the issue is just now beginning to resound, and basically not getting very much more response from industry, not response from the corporations. So that's who we're talking to. And I just want to add my support and my voice to all of the people gathered here to speak on defense of the earth itself and the defense of peace, real peace. Peace is not a absence of war. That's a truce. That's what's going on in Korea right now. Been there for years. That's a truce. No, peace is a robust relationship built on respect and understanding. And so I had my voice, and I hope that the public, which is who we have to depend on for proper response now, will help us and be aware that collectively we're looking to the future, 7 generations.
Oran, thank you very much for taking time today to be with us. Our next speaker and our last speaker is Professor Robert Howarth, a climate scientist from Cornell University. Professor Horowitz is a member of the Climate Action Council. This is a 22-member committee which is preparing a plan for New York State to achieve the emissions cuts set forth in the New York State Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which was passed by New York State in 2020. Bob?
Thank you, Peter. And I'm honored to join religious leaders in this climate statement on this week of Earth Day. Over the past century, the Earth has warmed by more than 1.1 degrees Celsius compared to the pre-industrial baseline, more than 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Mostly that's happened in the last 30 years, and it's driven clearly by a massive consumption of fossil fuels. As Peter said, the basic science for this has been known for well over 100 years. Planet's now the warmest it's been in 120,000 years, and the planet is warming at the fastest rate it has ever risen in billions of years of history of the planet. It's driven by fossil fuels, and more than half of all the fossil fuels that society's ever burned have been burned in the last 28 years. We are changing things very rapidly. So why are we concerned about warming? It's not the warming per se that's concerned, it's climate disruption. And we're seeing climate disruption already. We are seeing stronger storms, more frequent and greater floods, larger and more intense fires, longer and deeper droughts, pronounced changes in ocean and atmospheric circulations, which are going to continue to affect climate moving into the future. And a lot of people don't realize it, but already global climate disruption has decreased the potential agricultural production globally by 20% compared to where we'd be otherwise. The impacts of that are particularly acute in the developing world. Central American countries such as Honduras and Guatemala are hit particularly hard, and this is partly what's making so many climate refugees from that area at this point. Nonetheless, we continue to burn even more fossil fuels. The planet continues to warm. And increasingly, we run a risk of spiraling, runaway, and truly catastrophic, irreversible climate disruption. We're on a trajectory that may make human life far more difficult for thousands of years to come. Almost all climate scientists agree that a warming to 1.5 degrees is risky. We're at 1.1 now. Going to 2 degrees is hugely risky. And these are not far off targets. We're on a trajectory to be at 1.5 degrees in another 7 or 8 years from now. We'll hit 25 years from now, we'll be at the 2 degree mark unless we do something. So we need to act now. Time is running out. The good news is we have a path. Renewable energy sources and technologies are now quite affordable, in fact, less expensive than fossil fuels when we consider the damage to human health and to climate change. And to address the climate crisis, as Peter said, New York State came together and passed the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act in 2019. It mandates a 40% reduction in all greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and many other ambitious targets. But in just 9 years, we're to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions from cars, from heating and electricity, all sources, by 40%. That's an ambitious target, but it's what's needed if the world's really going to address climate change. The entire United States needs to be in that trajectory. As Peter mentioned, I'm one of the people on the 22-person council that's mandated by law to try and come up with an implementation plan. We're working hard on that. I'm quite optimistic we can meet these goals, but it's going to take huge buy-in and participation from everyone. The new act provides strong measures to make sure that environmental justice is served and that the most vulnerable among us are protected from climate disruption and from the pollution of fossil fuels, and that they can fully participate in needed energy transition. And I think faith leaders need to play a critical role in making sure that this truly does happen. So now is the time to work at the local level and find ways to reduce our use of fossil fuels and these carbon emissions. And I'm just delighted to have the faith community be part of this. So Olivia, Peter, back to you for questions. Thank you.
Bob, thank you very much. If any of the members of the press have questions, if you could use the raised hand function, and Olivia will acknowledge you. And then any individuals that have questions, if you could write them in the chat function. So Olivia, I'm turning it over to you.
Yep, any participants representing the press can just use the raise their hand feature, which you click participants at the bottom, and then you can click raise hand. And like Pete said, if you have a question and you're not from the press, just type it right into the chat box, and I can read it off for you. Okay, looks like we have a question from Scott Willis. I'm going to ask you to unmute so you can ask your question.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Well, thanks for doing this. I just wanted to know, maybe it was mentioned earlier, but the significance of the religious component of this. Why is it important to have the religious community behind this? And do we know if this is happening elsewhere in the state and the country?
Bishop Dede, would you like to address that, and then I could add something briefly, or?
I'm very glad to. As a Christian, I can speak for Christian faith. It's important because this is a gospel value. We believe that the world was created by God, and that we're entrusted with care, not only of creation, but of one another, that to love our neighbor as ourselves. And so the essential nature of climate change is just has been shared, how this impacts food production, water, sustainability. And, one of the things that's happening that needs to change is to start to identify when issues are climate related. We have refugees, we have wars, we have conflicts, that the contributing core reason is current changes in climate and of availability of resources. So as people of faith, it's essential that churches begin to speak out and be actively promoting different understandings. We have a civic responsibility, and we have a faith responsibility. This is also a spiritual issue. One of the reasons that there is such a prevalence of people overusing comes from all sorts of spiritual issues, of people being disconnected from the land and disconnected from one another, and corporate greed. And I think I would defer to Mr. Lyons, because he speaks very passionately about the ways in which greed contribute to climate change. And so these are spiritual issues and necessitate spiritual responses. And then also, as people of faith, to respond in ways that are have integrity. And unfortunately, you do see across religious spectrums, there are people of faith who wrestle with this issue and aren't at a place of understanding the real primacy and tragedy of the current situation. I'm glad that in some of us are already there, and it is our responsibility to love God and love our neighbor is to also respond to climate change.
Oran, would you like to add anything to that, or? You're muted, Oran. You're still muted.
Let me see if I can unmute him.
I think his son, is nice. There you go. You're live.
I'm sorry. Well, fundamentally, the spiritual laws of nature prevail. Nature is a powerful force. It has its laws, and if you don't understand those laws and you don't abide those laws, you just suffer the consequence. And so we've brought ourselves to this position by ignoring those laws and understanding what the spiritual strength is in terms of the universe. And so in a broad sense, I would say that the human beings, we ourselves, we're in an existential crisis of survival. And if we don't change the direction and do what's proper in terms to work with the with the laws of nature and the spiritual laws of the universe. I'll use the words of my friend John Mohawk, who has passed on now. I called him the resident intellect of Iroquois. He said, well, as far as I can see, the human beings are still a biological experiment. And that's just about where we are right now. We're not doing well in this experiment.
Scott, you also asked, is this happening elsewhere? There are some national organizations of faith specifically working on the issue of climate change. Locally in central New York, and I do not want to imply that other faith denominations are not addressing the issue, but because I'm a Roman Catholic, I'm most familiar with the Catholic activities. There is a Laudato Si committee working and planning a conference in May on the issue of climate change. Laudato Si committee was named after the papal encyclical on climate change. So, yes, there are faith groups working very hard on this issue. Other questions from the press? Olivia, are there any or?
There's no raised hands, but if any, oh, here we go. Oh yeah, no more raised hands, but if you have any more questions, you can go ahead and.
Olivia, there's a question in the chat box for Bob.
Great, yeah, so I think we're all set with the press questions, just last call. Okay. All right, we can go to the chat. So first there's a question from Catherine Burns. Changing from fossil fuels to renewables will cost a lot. I wonder if Dr. Howarth could address the Climate and Community Investment Act as a way to pay for the provisions of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act.
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, changing our energy system is going to take a lot of money, but we already put a huge amount of money into our energy systems. And Mark Jacobson, who's a brilliant engineer at Stanford, and I and others published a peer-reviewed paper now 8 years ago, where we drew up a plan for making the entire state of New York fossil fuel free within a period of about 20 years or so. And we did the economics. We were doing it in 2013 economics. Things have become much, much more favorable to renewables since then. Solar and wind are far cheaper. Batteries are far cheaper than then. But even in 2013, we calculated that the cost of making the entire state free of fossil fuels, completely free of fossil fuels, is equivalent to the cost we now pay in healthcare and premature deaths from air pollution caused by fossil fuels in New York over a 15-year period, which is the time it would take. We spend billions of dollars every year in lost school time, lost work time, premature deaths, hospital bills because of air pollution from fossil fuels. So the economics are actually very favorable for moving to renewables. The specifics of how we do it, there's a tremendous amount of detail to work out. I would encourage everyone to get engaged because the more creativity, the better. But let me give you an example. There are all sorts of hidden subsidies in our current fossil fuel system. When someone builds a new home, single family home in New York State right now, if you're near a gas line, by state law, the state connects you to that gas line. The gas company pays for it. The average cost is $30,000 per home, and then that's paid back by the ratepayers for the gas company over time. Well, one of the things we're considering in the Climate Action Council is to end that subsidy. And instead, I think we should say when you build a new home, you put in a high efficiency electric heat pump, and the electric utility fronts you the $25,000 or $30,000 it would cost, and then pays it back in the utility bill. Overall, ratepayers would pay less over time. We're solving the air pollution problem. We're solving the climate change problem, and there's no cost to the homeowner whatsoever. So there are many ways forward, but the more creative minds we have, the better. Great.
So it looks like we have a comment from from Kip Kerper. It says, I would add that there are two very strong interfaith organizations who are addressing the need for a faith-based response to these issues, greenfaith.org and Interfaith Power and Light. Does anyone want to comment on that?
Interfaith Power and Light actually helped promote the religious statement from the statement from religious leaders in New York State. So they have been very helpful with us with this project.
Okay, great. All right, and then we have another question. What financial incentive, rebates, grants, et cetera, are available for houses of worship to convert? I'm sorry, it just moved. To convert to using sustainable energy like solar and heat pumps?
Bob?
Yeah,
you-
I can take a stab at that. I'm not expert in the details, but NYSERDA, the New York State Energy and Research Development Authority, has a set of incentives to help generally nonprofit organizations, and I'm assuming that would apply to any faith-based organization with things like solar power and heat pumps. Of that, I would start by looking at NYSERDA, and there's a lot of help out there already. There's going to be a lot more help because as we ramp up this act, which is, it really only became law in January of 2020, we're going to have a draft plan for the implementation supposed to be done by December of this year. Next year is going to be the real time to start moving in implementation, but I think we're going to start to see very, very major changes with a lot more opportunities available to everyone, but certainly including faith-based organizations.
And just to add on to what Bob said, if you Google Heat Smart of Central New York, they are involved with a 5-county area project to promote air source and ground source, but what we call geothermal heat pumps. On Sunday, they just premiered a video on the Poplar Ridge, a Friends Meeting House, which added 2 air sourced. They converted from oil furnaces, I believe, to air sourced heat pumps. Or if you have additional questions, you can't find Heat Smart, just send me an email. My email address was listed on the press release. I'll put it in the chat if anyone needs to reach me for some reason. Olivia, other questions or?
Yep, we still have a few more. So question for Bob. I recently saw a film called Kiss the Ground, which concludes essentially that by changing our current industrialized agriculture to one that promotes soil health and microorganisms, we can sequester vast amounts of carbon and in so doing reduce CO2 levels in the atmosphere. How valid is this? Is the CLCPA addressing this?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think, let me phrase it this way. I think industrial agriculture is definitely bad for soil. It's definitely not sustainable in its current path in all sorts of environmental ways. It definitely releases a net amount of carbon, organic carbon from the soil to the atmosphere. It's been doing that over time. And so we want to reverse those trends. Some climate scientists think that is the best way forward. Most of us don't. Most of us, and I mean 95% of us who study it closely, think that we really have to tackle the fossil fuel addiction as our number one, and then deal with agriculture as well. We can have those soils pick up some more carbon. Putting some of that land back into forest is even better than keeping it in agriculture. Going to perennial crops instead of just growing corn helps, but it's not going to solve it. We really need to address the climate change issue head on, which is fossil fuels. The Climate Action Council under the CLCPA is looking very hard at the question of carbon uptake in soils. We had a 7-hour meeting of the council a week ago today, half of which was devoted to agricultural responses, and we're running through the calculations and all. There will be some proposals to try and make agriculture better and more carbon friendly, but it's not going to solve New York's issues. It really is a fossil fuel problem overall.
We have one additional comment from Joanna Higgins. It says, as long as the US is a capitalistic system and corporations are driven by profit, we will never get to where we need to be. One or two companies acting alone will not make a difference, and in fact will be reluctant to do it as long as companies which do not follow their example will make higher profits. Only forceful government mandates and penalties will make companies comply.
Well, let me just quickly respond to that. The Climate Action Council, the CLCPA, the law, which is now the law of the state of New York, does precisely that. It sets, these aren't goals, they're mandates. It mandates that all greenhouse gas emissions from the state will go down by 40%. And the ramifications of that does not happen. There are other goals in there as well. So the details are going to matter. If we hit that mandate directly on in time, I'm not sure, but we're certainly going to try. I do think it's entirely possible. And through that sort of regulatory oversight and combination of incentives and disincentives, I think it'll happen. Let me give you one example that we're talking about on the council, which is electrification of transportation. And clearly, if we have more livable cities and people are commuting less, that's an important part of it, and we should be pushing for that, and we should put incentives in. But to the extent we drive cars, they should be electric vehicles moving forward. Currently, electric vehicle costs are slightly more for a new car in terms of the initial cost than as an internal combustion engine. But when you look at the maintenance costs and fuel costs over time, electric vehicles in New York are already cheaper. And the council is very likely to propose that we take actions such as banning the sale of new internal combustion engines statewide by 2035. California already has such a mandate. New York is very likely to join that. And we're discussing having a tax on sales of new internal combustion engines, which starts fairly soon in the future and increases over time until 2035 when we ban it totally. That we take the cash flow from that and we use it to subsidize the purchase of electric vehicles, including used electric vehicles, and particularly for the economically unfortunate among us. So, that's, I think, a strong regulatory response to the capitalist system in which we live, and I think it'll work.
Oran, you had something you wanted to add?
Yeah. There was a group called the Spiritual and Parliamentary Leaders for Human Survival that asked me to participate some years back, 1980s, 88, so forth. And part of this, that group was Mother Teresa, the Dalai Lama, Al Gore. It was a cross section of leaders around the world, spiritual and parliamentary. And we met in Oxford on the issue. In 1988, we met in Moscow with President Gorbachev as our invitee. He's the one that brought us there. And then later on, we met at the big meeting in Rio de Janeiro in 1972. And the question arose when we were in Tokyo. And I asked the leader, the Akio Matsumura, who was our executive director at the time, I said, Akio, when do we come to a conclusion here? We're just going to keep meeting. So we put it in front of the group, which was by that time probably 300 people from around the world, and very powerful leaders from all aspects of the world. And it came to a conclusion. And the conclusion was 4 words: value change for survival. If you don't change your values, you're not going to survive. And that was the discussion you just talked about, the capitalist system and so forth, which is really the train wreck in operation right now. If you don't change that, you're not going to get any kind of a relief from that system. It's a big fundamental change, but it's necessary for survival. The principle that we've always operated on here with the Haudenosaunee is to share. to share. Share and be respectful.
We have another question here. What are religious organizations' positions on conserving 30% lands and waters by 2030? Also, the environmental amendment to New York's Bill of Rights, clean water, clean air, and healthy environment for all.
I'll turn to you, Bishop Dede. I mean, I honestly do not know the answer.
Well, I think the answer is it's complex. It depends on who you talk to. There are definitely those of us who are very committed to addressing these issues, who are looking actively for ways to reduce and the use and to abide by that. And so there's great support and large portions, as you know, some of these organizations that have been mentioned are working with great diligence in these areas. So, but that's part of why we're here today, is to speak for these changes being made and the importance of them and the essential nature for faith to make these changes.
Thank you. Olivia? Oh, Oran, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to bring it to attention. You know, the term population, human population, which is when I was 20 years old, 1950, there were 2.5 billion people in the whole world. That's 70 years ago. 2.5 billion. Today, there's probably close to 8 billion. That's flat out not sustainable. Triple the population in one lifetime, when it took all those many hundreds and thousands of years to get to 2.5 billion, and then within one lifetime, go to 8 billion. You better wake up. You know, we've eaten everything off the face of the earth. There was just a handful of gorillas left. Everybody, they even have names. That's how few there are. And, you know, a handful of tigers left. The elephants are fighting for survival there. We've moved all of life off the earth and just human beings here. It's going to be pretty lonesome, folks.
Thank you, Oran.
It looks like that's most of the questions. There were some comments made in the chat, but does anyone else have any other questions they want to throw in the chat?
Anything coming in, Olivia, or no?
No more
Wait,
questions.
Bess has her hand, I guess, press, or you wanna
Yep, I can
unmute Bess?
unmute her.
How do denominations deal with maintaining their tax exempt status and not cross the line of separation of church and state in regards to voting for elected officials who recognize and are willing to take action on climate change? And also with that question, were Representatives Katko and Tenney invited to this seminar?
Well, I can speak to the first part, which is that we do not endorse candidates specifically or platforms. We work for issues. The Office of Government Relations for the Episcopal Church is continually active in Washington and Albany, advocating for the values that are espoused by our denomination. In our denomination, we have 3 core values of evangelism, racial reconciliation, and climate care, and addressing issues of climate change and working toward that. We don't endorse candidates specifically, but we do advocate with candidates. I've been to Washington on a couple of occasions to do advocacy work to speak with representatives. I regularly write to our representatives. Recently, in conjunction with this, I have written to our representatives to advocate. So in terms of the tax exempt status, that has to do with our being a part of civic community activism, but that is not tied to a party and partisanship. The second part of your question, I'll leave that to Peter.
If I could just add a little bit to the first part. In the case of the CLCPA, it is now existing law, and if faith leaders and faith communities want to get involved in making that law become implemented, that's not advocacy even. That's on the ground level. It's no longer lobbying for the bill. If you're not familiar with it, take a look at it. The goals are great, and again, the commitment to the environmental justice aspects of it are just threaded and integral to the bill. So there's a big opening there for the faith community to be engaged.
That's in regard to the invitation to Representative Tenney and Representative Katko. Representative Tenney, yes, I am like 99% sure I got to her office and sent the press release. I am embarrassed to say that I did contact Representative Katko's office, and I got a recording that due to COVID, they're not operating in, you think, what is it, in office or whatever. And since I am a one-person band that have been working on this project for about 2.5 months, literally some weeks putting in 30 hours. No offense to the representatives of the religious communities, but it was a little bit like herding cats to get a reply back. So I did not, I honestly, and I'm embarrassed to say, I did not send the press, did take the follow-up time to track down and get the email address and the name of the staff person with Representative Katko's office. This press conference is being recorded, and on my to-do list is to get back to all the representatives, including Representative Katko, and say that if they would like, I will send them the link with the recording so they can hear the comments and the questions, etc.
We do have a few more questions. The first one is what?
One thing, I know Bishop Dede has to leave at 3 o'clock, so we should be respectful. If you have a question specifically for her, please send it in like in the next minute or so. And Bob and Oran, if you, I don't know how long the rest of the questions will take, but maybe if we could plan to wrap it up with three-ish, but if Bishop Dede has to leave, I'd like to thank her in advance very much for her time.
Yep, if anyone has any questions specific for her, you can put them in. We can address those first.
There's one there from Guillermo Metz. It seems oriented towards the bishop, if you can see that.
Okay, yes, I see that. All right, so they said, this is great, so not a criticism, but wondering how this proclamation will be used to influence parishioners or other religious institutions. What exactly will be done going forward to move people off of fossil fuels?
Well, this next week, I'm actually going to be at St. James Skaneateles on Earth Day and celebrating with them and recognizing that time. In the diocese, we are working on to green up our churches. We're in active conversations about things utilizing solar and other alternative. In terms of fossil fuel emissions, we've been having lots of conversations about how to reduce, and especially as we are doing today with Zoom, reducing people traveling, lowering our carbon footprint. And also within the entire Episcopal Church, there's been a real focus on how to be more effective in utilizing other technology rather than flying. As a bishop, often I'm flying all kinds of places, and instead of flying to visit more virtually. And so, and also then the advocacy with parishioners. Every week I talk about issues that have to do with civic, whether it's anti-racism, racial reconciliation work, whether it's the need for legislation in other areas, and then also having to do with climate change and living as good stewards of creation. Some of the best ways that churches can actually be engaged is by educating and helping to empower parishioners and people to have a deeper understanding of the needs and thereby share the message so that they become advocates in their own right. And so sharing and discipling people in the understanding of the importance of this was one of, I think, the key roles that churches can play, is to be places of education and action and bringing people together across differences.
Oh,
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to also say the statement and the signatories from the statement. I wrote an op-ed piece and submitted it to the Eagle Bulletin, which is a weekly, which goes throughout the county, and also wrote an op-ed piece and submitted it to the Post Standard. It is in the online edition of the Post Standard. And generally, if they put it in the online, it will eventually show up in print. So this will help get the message out to the community that the religious community is solidly behind efforts to address climate change. And I know Bob also was successful in getting some coverage down in the Ithaca area. So, you know, we are trying very, very hard to get the word out to a wide, you know, casting a wide net to the public. Olivia?
We have another question. What can we do to help get the CCLIA Act passed?
Well, I think the you know, the one thing, the obvious, and even though it's obvious, I think a lot of times we don't do it, is to contact our representatives. You know, climate change awareness and action was part of a statewide coalition of over 200 organizations that helped to get the passage of this the CLCPA, and that legislation is what Bob is working on now, codified into law the admission cuts. You know, now Bob's doing the detail work. Bob and his committee. You shouldn't say Bob. You know, the committee is coming up with a detailed plan on how to achieve those cuts. So, same thing with the CCIA. You know, it's sort of like dull, boring work that we all need to remind ourselves is very important. If you get on the phone, you call up your rep. You know, you say, look, you know, this is important legislation. What's the position of my representative? And then would he or she vote for it? Bob or anyone else would like to add something? Or
No, I think that's exactly right. Contact your legislators. Let them know how you feel. Write letters to the paper. Get your friends and neighbors to do so as well. I think that's what it takes. That's how the CLCPA was finally passed. It took several years for the CLCPA. I will point out, someone said that we need this new bill to fund the CLCPA, and that's partially true. It's partially not true. There's a lot that can be done without extra additional funding, but we will need extra funding. Hopefully, when the Climate Action Council comes up with our draft implementation plan for the CLCPA by the end of this year, we'll give some specific recommendations as to where and how much specific funding will be needed. And I think that'll be a good time to pick it up further with your legislators. It's extra ammunition, if you will. So look out for the end of the year.
I think I would want to re-emphasize. I mean, even on the municipal level, a good example is the town of Manlius. Their town board, and I hate to, you know, I hate to have this as a partisan issue, Democrat versus Republican. You know, unfortunately, it has become somewhat of a partisan issue, or more, you know, more than somewhat. But the town of Manlius, the town council flipped from Republican to Democrat. You know, and so what that means is now there is a lot more talk and consideration plans for community solar farms. So, you know, municipal elections, and I'm a good example. I can't, you know, I ignored them for years. And now I realize from the municipal level up, it's important that we all, you know, get our voice in there and vote for candidates that'll come up with good public policy. You know, the value type stuff that Oran was talking about, and Bishop Beatty and with Bob, you know, the values that we believe are important to create the society we want to live in. Oran, I don't know if I saw your hand or.
Yeah, I would remind everybody that with the Biden administration, they just moved John Kerry up into a cabinet position for environment, which is huge. That's huge. He needs the support of all of us in this regard. The past administration was taking us in the opposite direction and caused a lot of damage. But I think it was very necessary to wake people up as to where we are today. We didn't have that slap in the face of the realities that we're facing today by the direction that was taken by the former president. It's just a wake-up call for everybody. So Kerry's cabinet position for environment, I think, is key for support, and I think this administration is going to move hard on that. So we have a friendly position towards environment right now.
Thank you, Ron. Olivia, are we?
Yeah, maybe in the interest of time, we could take like 2 more questions. Does that work? If you want to wrap up.
Just leave it 3.
Okay. So here's another one. Has anyone ever done anything about controlling the development and change to life in genetic engineering?
Collective silence.
Could you repeat that question, please?
Has anyone ever done anything about controlling the development and change to life in genetic engineering?
No, I'll speak for myself.
Well, you know, genetic engineering, you know, is you're fussing with nature again. And every time you start fussing with nature, you know, the results are sometimes not what you were searching for. So I would just say, be careful.
Anyone, next question, I guess, or next and last question, maybe?
Yep, and then we have one, here it is. Okay, is there any way we can meet our climate goals while new buildings are going up that burn fossil fuels for heating? Do we need a ban on fossil fuel heating in new construction?
That's a Bob question.
Yeah, I'll pick that up. The question is from Bill Nowak, and for those of you who don't know, Bill is actually on one of the panels for the Climate Action Council and is an expert on this, so it's a bit of a insider question, but the answer is no. We cannot continue to put fossil fuels into new construction, and the panel that Bill is on, I believe, is making that recommendation. It's going to come to the full Climate Action Council at our next meeting, and I believe a strong majority of us will support that. So I think we are going to see a ban on the use of fossil fuels in all new construction, homes and businesses. It's just a matter of how long we take to implement that. That has to be the way forward. And as I tried to point out earlier, it already makes economic sense from the standpoint of either society or a homeowner to move this way. It's simply that people don't realize that, and there's all this momentum. So this is a regulatory approach that we can help people do what actually is best for them as well as for the society. Great question, Bill.
Olivia, just a quick housekeeping, but important, and especially while Bishop Beatty is still on. I rarely get to speak face to face with Bishop. There was a lot of great wisdom. You know, the comments and the presentations were very thoughtful, and I'd like to thank Bob and Oran and Bishop Beatty for your time today, and Olivia for running the meeting. Everybody that's on the call, you know, this is where the work begins. We will send the link out with this presentation. You know, we need to get this presentation to a much larger audience. You have Facebook pages, you have networks, you have colleagues. So sometime in the next day or two, you will get a follow-up email with the link and a request to share it and help spread the word. And I will be getting back to all of our legislators, you know, the senators and the assembly people and the common council and the county representatives, you know, with this release and with this press conference. So I will say thank you, but if Bishop Didi or Bob or Oran want to say anything, I don't want the last word. So I'm signing off, but thank you very much.
I would just like to thank you, Peter, for organizing this and for all of the faith leaders for rising to this challenge. I just think this is exactly what the state and the world needs right now. So thank you.
Yes, thank you all for being here, making time. It's my honor and privilege. And Oran, please, you have the last word.
I just want to put in the last statement from that cartoon character, our friend Pogo. And he said, I have seen the enemy and it is us. So there you are.
There you go. Thank you very much,
Thank
everyone.
you all. Blessings. Thank you.
Take care.